Welcome everybody. Thanks for the patience as we sort of got some of our logistics straightened out. This is Matthew Carter with the Delaware T-Squared Center, and I'm with the LTAP Training Resources Work Group as well. Victoria, our chair, could not be here today, so she asked me to introduce Mark Hood. So today we're going to be having a look at the new NCHRP report dealing with technology transfer, and Mark was instrumental in putting that together, and he'll talk more about that in a moment. So just by way of quick introduction for those who aren't familiar with Mark, he is a senior traffic safety engineer for Pannoni Associates and the Pennsylvania LTAP program. Got 22 years of experience in the safety, traffic engineering, and technology transfer fields.
Thank you very much.
Serving federal, state, municipal, and private clients throughout the country. So he provides training and technical assistance to Pennsylvania's 2,500 local governments to help define and solve their traffic engineering and highway safety problems. He serves as technical consultant on PennDOT's research implementation contract, and he's the PI on Pennsylvania's Safe Routes to School program and other projects. So I'll turn it over to Mark. Obviously, he's got a clear background in technology transfer, and he'll tell us more about this new resource. Mark?
Thanks, Matt, for that introduction, and I think our ground rules are set. Sounds like we're not having any feedback come in or anything like that. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I hate to start off with an apology, but I seem to be losing my voice since this weekend, so I'll do my best as we move along here. But if you hear my voice crack, that's me, not your lines that are going out. The other note is, just as a side note, we had a bit of a storm here up in State College, and we had a pretty significant power outage in this part of the town. So I'm having a bit of difficulty hearing others on the line. So if there are questions later on that I don't get to or hear, just feel free to follow up with email after the presentation. That's fine. So thanks to all here for taking some time today to learn about the NCHRP report number 768 entitled Guide to Accelerating New Technology Adoption Through Directed Technology Transfer. This guide was developed as part of the NCHRP Project 20-93, which finished up around this time last year, followed by an editing process resulting in the guide, which was released around June of this year. And just for those who are not familiar with it, which I imagine is many of you, the report and guide present a framework, really, and a guidance on how to use technology transfer to guide and accelerate innovation within state DOTs and the local roadway community as well. So we hope that this guidance will be helpful for a whole range of different agency personnel with really any level of experience in adoption of new technology. So we tried to make the guide as comprehensive and useful as possible with some illustrative examples on introducing innovations into an organization or into others, as well as policy that might involve anything from engineering design, materials, operations, a whole range of different things. So there's a 30-second overview of the document itself. And a few months ago, Victoria had asked me to present this webinar just to give an overview of this new guide. So that's really our purpose today, is to provide you guys with an introduction to Report 768. It's certainly not a training, but more of a summary of the guide, and it's intended so that, if you pick something up today, you hear or see something that's of interest, the idea is that you can follow up and access the guide from the TRB website. You can download it or order a paper copy, whatever it is that you might find most useful. And after the webinar, hopefully, when you open that guide and start to explore it, you'll be able to more quickly recognize the different parts after hearing the presentation, explore them in more detail to see how the document works. So from a webinar outline, if you would, after that little background there, I'd like to talk a little bit about the development of the guide, including the leadership and guidance we received. I'll provide an overview of the different parts of the guide and get into a little bit more detail in primarily the background and introduction role so you can see how the guide is organized, what types of information you'll find in there, and kind of walk you through an example at the end. All right, so right ahead here. I'd like to start off by kind of introducing the project panel that was associated with NCHRP 20-93. It was a panel put together of experts in the field of technology transfer, and many of you may recognize many of the names on here. The panel was chaired by Shane Brown, and the TRB staff representative was Andrew Leamer. And you'll see that the panel members really come from a wide variety of agencies and organizations, different sizes, all of which really had very unique perspectives on technology transfer, and all of them really brought valuable input into the project. I think that it was incredibly valuable to have a pretty diverse group of people, where some primarily come from a DOT research background, others came from an LTAP, TTAP background, one or two came from both, but really all had experience with technology in one form or another. So in some ways, in most ways, that was a real positive, and it really made our guide, I think, a little bit more robust than it might otherwise have been, and the panel really provided some nice leadership in that way. At the same time, it certainly made it challenging for all of us to balance all the different interests and perspectives to come in. Our research team that put the guide together is shown up on the screen here. Myself and Steve from Pinoni Associates were kind of the prime consultants on that, with several subs from Vance and Renz, and Barbara Hire, I think, is on our call today. Joe Toole and Sam Hunter from Penn State. And much like our panel, I think we brought a rather diverse group together, and perspectives together from both the LTAP, TTAP world and work to private industry that Sam brought in. He's an industrial organizational psychologist to look at different perspectives from that standpoint, and Joe's perspective from a former Federal Highway Administrator, combined with myself and Bob and Mike and Barbara, who have some considerable experience working together as a technology transfer and implementation team to PennDOT, in which we've really tried to help PennDOT develop an effective and research and innovation kind of implementation system, in which over 110 innovations have been implemented over the first 7 years of this project, and took that experience and the technology transfer aspect of that into play here with our guide. So it's just a little bit about our team and the panel that was put together for developing our NCHRP report 768. The report itself here, just the cover shown on the screen, is a bit different than our final report that we have presented, primarily in terms of formatting and organization and those type of things. So let's talk a little bit about the guide and the main purpose of it here. As you all know, really the viability of today's transportation system in our nation depends on innovation. That innovation can make our transportation system safer, it can make it last longer, operate more efficiently, but meeting those challenges that impede those goals of safety and efficiency really require the expeditious development and implementation of good creative solutions to different problems that are faced in all aspects. Technology transfer, or as I'll use the term T2 today, is really an integral function of that process, and the idea is that it really helps to advance many of those innovations that are out there and bring those new ideas both within the transportation organization and externally, pushing that technology out. The guide was developed to really help with that process. Was meant to be complementary to previous work, many of you are probably familiar with the old Transportation Research Circular 488 the primer on technology transfer, and this is kind of a follow-up to that. So ultimately the purpose here is to develop and help the reader or user of this guide identify, plan, and implement good, effective technology transfer strategies to help accelerate good, informed decision-making and bring innovations from ideas and putting them into practice. So that's really what we're hopeful that our guide can do, and educate readers about technology transfer to help them in that broader process of innovation deployment. As we briefly mentioned, the development of this guide really was steered by our panel and by our team, and all the kind of diverse backgrounds that were put together. But in addition to that, our individual thinking was supported by a pretty extensive review of literature in the technology transfer realm, both in the context of transportation as well as in other industries. The literature review really boiled down to a little over 200 citations that focused specifically on how transportation agencies, other public agencies, private industry apply innovation to practice and what tools they're using to do that. So it really included introducing innovation resulting from a research project or a new regulation, so sort of pushing out information, as well as pushing technology into the operational sector. So what I would encourage folks to do if they're interested in this topic is to check that literature out, literature search out online. I put a link in there. It is still up on the TRB website, and I think it's quite informative, that a document that not only summarizes our thinking, but really primarily what the literatures had presented us with regard to technology transfer. So again, I'll put a little plug in for that. I think it's an excellent literature review and has a great deal of additional reading and resources for those involved in this topic. The guide itself, though, is not really a research paper per se. It's more built on the foundation of that research. So to augment that literature review, our effort included interviews with the different DOT chief executive officers. We had interviews and surveys done with many of our LTAP and TTAP centers, as well as different DOT research unit heads through the AASHTO RAC committee, and as well as different anecdotal information gathering at different LTAP national meetings and the TRB annual meetings that were occurring during the project itself. So it was quite a bit of kind of data gathering that went into making sure that we were being comprehensive in what we were trying to do. In developing the guide and searching the kind of the body of technology transfer, one interesting point, not really surprising but interesting, was that there was not really a singular, clear definition for the term technology transfer. In fact, there were many, many different varying definitions because of the wide variety of ways that the term is used. So a synthesis of those definitions, which was put into the literature search document for those most applicable to the needs of the highway community, is presented in the guide. And this is kind of what we used after our first task as our overall statement, if you would. That technology transfer is how ideas, knowledge, practices, products, processes, or techniques are shared between and within organizations. So that is the definition that we used in this particular guide. And to follow up with that, the act of transfer involves at least two parties, a source and a recipient, and is usually purposeful, initiated by the source, the recipient, mutually by both, or by a third party acting as a transfer agent. So it's a rather comprehensive definition. It fits a number of different purposes that different agencies have used it. And a couple of key points that come out of this, which really formulate the thinking process behind the different chapters in the guide, is that when we talk about technology transfer, it's very broadly defined. It could be tangible, such as hardware, software, or even intangible, like knowledge or practices, the why and how of something that's new. And that there's at least two parties involved in that transfer, a source and a recipient. So much like the variety of definitions that we found, real-world T2 processes can and will vary based on the agency, based on their particular interests, the innovation itself, different components of technology transfer that have already been addressed through the early research phase, and a number of other factors. So T2 as a practice can be quite complex and is often messy, but hopefully our guide presents a single generalizable process that can be customized for your use, for a user's use. The guide then, or focuses on the majority of the guide, provides direction in planning and executing a good coordinated technology transfer effort. It's built on 10 key components, which you see up on your screen now, that follow from that T2 definition. So together, these 10 components provide the user of the guide with a roadmap, if you would, through that complex T2 process. You'll see the different components which actually form the different chapters in our guide, include addressing societal and legal issues, having an effective champion for your innovation, if you would, engaging decision makers, developing a plan, identifying, informing, and engaging stakeholders, identifying and securing resources, conducting demonstrations and showcases, providing education, informing, providing technical assistance, evaluating progress, and reaching ultimately a deployment decision. And many of these components here, these different components, can be grouped for ease of use, which we'll talk about. Some might be, rather than hardcore, if you would, traditional technology transfer methods or components, might be addressed earlier on in the process or even later on in the process. So it's quite a fluid idea, and our guide kind of walks a user through which components have you already addressed, which ones are you trying to address, what kind of order should you go in, what kind of questions should you answer, those type of things. So it is really important to emphasize that real-world technology transfer can and will vary based on the agency, the innovation, the components, all those type of things. But this process should help with that. Okay. So who benefits from that guide? Given all of those different components, who might want to use this guide, pick it up, and find some good information in it that they can use, and how might they do that? We boiled our user groups down, if you would, into 3 primary groups: novices, people who are new to technology transfer, so those who are experienced with technology transfer within their agency, what we call experienced T2 practitioners, and then third, experienced T2 practitioners with a particular challenge to address. So there are a wide variety of transportations who are engaged in technology transfer, whether they be engineers, researchers themselves, and users, and the guide helps you define where you might fit among those different groups. Professionals work in a variety of settings, including state DOTs, other state agencies such as Department of Motor Vehicles, state and local law enforcement, public works agencies, federal agencies such as USDOT or Federal Highway, and then others who play key roles in transferring technologies to transportation agencies such as the LTAP and TTAP centers, the university transportation centers, private sector companies, and universities. So to summarize, the guide is really intended for anyone who has an interest in applying innovations to solve transportation sector problems. So the guide was designed to assist kind of that wide range of spectrum of practitioners. Hopefully we feel that with novices, the guide can introduce those to what technology is if you're just kind of getting into this world and the different components to be successful. Someone who's more experienced can provide a review and refresher to facilitate their processes within their organizations. And then experienced folks who are looking to address a particular challenge. Maybe I'm having trouble getting my champion involved to help with some of the technology transfer efforts, or setting up a demonstration showcase program. How do I do those kinds of things? The guide can direct them to the right particular chapter, which they can get into some detail there. So how is the guide organized? The guide is organized, as shown on the screen, into several different sections. It has a summary at the beginning, just kind of a little bit of background and whatnot. And then following the summary are 11 different chapters. I separated out just chapter 1 for a reason on the slide, because I think the background section includes a great deal of information that will be very useful other than just the 10 key components. I'll go through that in the following slides, but I would like to emphasize that the background section has a great deal of useful tools to make the guide easier to use for you. Chapters 2 through 11 are basically the 10 key components for technology transfer, those things that we had up on the previous slide. And each chapter has a great deal of information, resources, tools, challenges that you might face, techniques for overcoming those challenges for each of those different components in them. Following that are 2 appendices, which include a technology transfer checklist and some suggested readings in the second appendix. So kind of an overall comprehensive guide for that. Just to give you an idea in a little bit more detail on these, Chapter 1 really defines technology transfer, as we did in the slide a little bit earlier, and describes how it's used to advance innovation and help bring new ideas throughout or internal to transportation organizations. It also describes the role of technology transfer in the larger process of identifying innovations all the way through deployment. The technology transfer process is a part of that. I'll refer to that process as the innovation adoption process, as it is in the guide. In other words, it shows where technology fits in the larger context of the process of identifying a need for an innovation all the way through deployment. So, as such, the chapter really describes the actions a reader can take, the fluid process with many different tendrils that reach early on in that big process and continue on after the hardcore technology transfer has been accomplished. Then the last part of the chapters really provide details on how the different components of a successful effort can be organized. So how can the reader organize all this information using a checklist and picking out the key parts that might be most useful for them? As I mentioned, the components chapters really get into the details of each of the individual components. There's a series of leading questions that help a reader really decide how to get through the components in a manner that makes most sense given what they're looking for and their needs. So let's get into some detail on the contents of each of these and where a user might start with this particular guide. Well, first of all, since we're dealing with many different transportation practitioners who might have involvement in technology transfers, such as engineers, planners, policymakers, contractors, researchers, both novices and experts, I believe it's our feeling that really all can find some value in each chapter of the guide. So the summary in that first chapter really suggests the most useful and efficient way for you to use that guide, depending on your expertise. So novices, we recommend start with Chapter 1 and summary, just to learn some of the basics of what technology transfer is as we define it, and to understand where it fits into the larger process of the innovation adoption process. Experienced practitioners can really get a refresher on that type of thing, and then the experienced practitioners might be able to skip through Chapter 1 once they're familiar with the guide and have used it a number of times. They can go to the individual chapters 2 through 11 to address their particular challenge. Some of the items or key parts to Chapter 1, or the background, include these four shown on the screen. It provides the definition. It explains that technology transfer is a process that frequently involves change, and that the diffusion and acceptance of new ideas or practices often requires changing people's attitudes and preconceptions and beliefs, something that rarely happens quickly. And unfortunately, the longer technology transfer takes, the longer those who have a need have to wait to achieve the benefits of the improvement or the innovation. So by enhancing technology transfer capabilities, hopefully the benefits such as cost savings or safety enhancements can be realized more quickly and efficiently. So much of the work in Chapter 1 in defining technology transfer and fitting into a whole process used Rogers' categories of innovation adopters. So, and I'll show you a little graphic on that in a second. And Chapter 1 then goes on to explain, while it's an integral function of advancing innovation, it helps really bring those new ideas towards deployment, which is a key means to foster identifying those new processes. So one of the figures in the report, as shown here, looks at a typical diffusion process as described by Rogers over time, and the percent of individuals either within a DOT, for example, or local agencies who might be using a particular innovation or technology using the 5 categories. And hopefully, by using more of a guided T2 process through the use of this guide, we can shift that bell curve a little bit to get a more efficient or quicker adoption of many of the innovations that are in place starting off, and diffuse that information throughout an organization or to other agencies more quickly and efficiently. And that's hopefully what we're getting at with this guide. So I've mentioned a few times the innovation adoption process and where T2 fits into this, and what our guide would like to focus on. Chapter 1 really outlines the process of what we called innovation adoption and the different parts to that process, from identifying a particular need, the research and development phase, the hardcore, if you would, technology transfer, which is what we're focusing on, all the way through deployment. So the 4 steps on here. And the way this might work in our guide is that it uses, in the first chapter, those kind of 4 broad aspects of the innovation adoption process to place technology transfer as we use it in context. So this graphical representation we're going to show you on the slide shows kind of the discrete function that technology transfer plays and what actions practitioners might encounter and they may need to address. So the small showing chart there in your screen obviously isn't a full page in the guide, but just looking at it graphically is the main point, such that the entire innovation process, as we define it, starts off with a need. And that need is identified by an organization who identifies a problem, searches for technology that offers a potential solution, which is shown there in that orange block. Potential solutions to problems, whether they be products that fulfill a specific need or a new method that improves current practices, they're referred collectively as technology. So it might be a process, it might be a tool, if you would. And the guide walks you through the definition of the need and how organizations might go about that process as an introduction. From there, the blue part of that chart asks the question, well, if there's a need for something, are there solutions already out there? Are there things internally that we're doing that we can disseminate better throughout the organization? Are there things outside that we can pull in? Do those solutions work? Could it work here in our particular agency? So once those technologies have been identified for potential transfer, whether it be, as I said, other studies, suggestions, field offices, other agencies, those type of things. The organization who's working with technology transfer can determine the feasibility of that technology for its intended use. Is it going to work, and could it work here? Once that's been determined through, say, research and development, we then step into where our guide fits in. Technology transfer, as defined in our guide, formally starts when an identified feasible technology is available and work begins on transferring it either throughout an organization or to other organizations. So you'll see here the components here are listed as good guided technology transfer components. Once technology transfer is complete, a decision to deploy that technology, or in some cases not, is then made, and it then would follow those steps once the deployment of that technology follows through. So implementing some of the deployment plan that might be in place, evaluating and sharing the results, things that kind of step beyond the traditional technology transfer realm. So that yellow piece of the puzzle is where this guide is focused. And one of the primary thoughts with the guide is that that phase has different components to it. So what types of actions or components to a good process can be used to help guide technology transfer to make that entire innovation process flow? So the components not only provide a reader or user of the guide with a roadmap through technology transfer, they also highlight topics where challenges might be encountered and how those challenges might be overcome. Okay? Now, one of the important points that our team wanted to make, and we tried to make in our guide, is that oftentimes technology transfer flows over those boundaries, meaning there are technology transfer activities that can occur all the way back in defining a need or deciding whether that product is going to work in a particular location. So while it might not be the hardcore or formal technology transfer, there are opportunities early on in that process that would allow an agency to complete some of the steps early, or to set themselves up in place to make sure that the technology transfer process can flow. So to, I guess, augment that, or to describe those things, in Chapter 1, we provide some information on early technology transfer opportunities. What sort of things can build a foundation to make your technology transfer activities work and work well? That's included there in Chapter 1. As an example, since there are multiple paths through which an individual or organization can begin a search for new ideas, they all have one thing in common. They're based on a need, that the need an organization has for a solution to a problem. And the need identification initiates the entire adoption process, if you would, and that need might be conducted during an internal search or an external search or a research study, or it might be a push technology. A new regulation is passed, and we need to figure out how we're going to implement a process to make or have that regulation or our agency come into compliance with that regulation. So just as a quick example of that might be the Federal Highways retroreflectivity requirements, which came out a few years ago in the METCD. And the standards that were established for setting up a system to maintain signs at night at minimum levels of retroreflectivity were identified in the METCD. And it put the onus on agencies to comply with that particular regulation. So a need was readily identified because a regulation was passed. And different agencies were searching for different solutions to this particular challenge. So the need was driven. The next block, the blue block, might identify different solutions to that particular need. And as we go through that, you can realize that there are different opportunities in each of those for technology transfer. So for example, documenting a successful application of the technology elsewhere in your organization to persuade stakeholders and decision makers to consider it as a potential solution throughout the agency. So one DOT district might have had a nice process for evaluating their signs at night, but maybe different districts had different processes. So internally, you might have found a solution that works in one particular district, and maybe we can make that particular solution disseminate throughout the agency by making it a policy. From there, once you've done those type of things, you can get into some of the what we'll call the hardcore, the yellow core of the technology transfer efforts, and doing demonstration projects and sending out technical memos and providing assistance for each of those. So even in defining the need, there are different items or opportunities for technology transfer to present itself. Similarly, as I mentioned during that loop block, once that technology offers a potential solution, maybe additional research and evaluation might be needed before it's really ready to be transferred. So we need to really determine, is this thing feasible within our organization? That period of evaluation in that blue block, if you would, is not only an opportunity to determine actually performs as intended, but also an opportunity to evaluate the practicality and feasibility of that technology for your need. So when doing those kind of things, again, this laying the foundation for eventual T2 activities through communication, through leadership. Here, initially addressing some of the legal issues, including intellectual property concerns, might need to be addressed at this point, or at least initially addressed before full technology transfer activities can occur. So, as you can see, the guide itself is really attempting to take a lot of the information and a lot of processes here and refine it down to one small block. And that's why I emphasized for those who are going to use this guide to read through the summary and read through the background information so that you can see how we define technology transfer and how the guide can help you with the solutions that you're looking for, if you would, whether it be you're in the need stage, you're in the R&D stage, are there things that we can do during this time that can help with our future efforts, and then provide the bulk of the information on the different efforts within each of the 10 components. So I know that's a lot of information to throw at you to start here, and as you can see, it's a complicated process, but once you start to see how the guide works and how the guide is organized, you'll be better able to find your way around in there and develop different solutions to your technology problems. Okay? So I'd like to continue on and kind of point out a few other key points and parts to the guide and still walk you through an example of how this guide might be useful for you. Okay. One of the things that we did to kind of ease all of that information flow into you in the guide was to organize our components after all that background information where you can see it fits into a larger process, and then give some details determining the different, what we call tiers of components. So we organize the components into groups, and also provide a little bit more information on potential users and how you might want to identify yourself within a user group for the guide. The tiers, if you would, or organization of the components were threefold. The first tier were foundation or organizational components. These components establish basically the infrastructure for the T2 process. Things like addressing society and legal issues, social media issues, those type of things. Making sure that the effective champion who perhaps identified the need or perhaps found a feasible solution can provide guidance to those or be involved heavily in the T2 activities, depending on what the roles that your folks in your organization have. Engaging decision makers. Again, those type of things will traditionally happen, or at least hopefully happen, early on in the overall process, but they should be engaged throughout the entire T2 process as well to make sure that the efforts you're making, or as a technology transfer specialist, if you would be making a difference in making sure these solutions are deployed throughout the agency. Developing a T2 plan, understanding where you'd like to go with this and what activities you can plan out over time. Informing and engaging those stakeholders who will have a role in using that particular solution or technology. And identifying and securing resources. So these foundational organizational things, while might have tendrils earlier on in the process, all play a role within, if you would, the hardcore technology transfer activities as well. From there, the second group we called knowledge building. These include how to address the understanding of both the need and the solution so that they can inform stakeholders, decision makers, end users about the innovation, why it's needed, what its benefits are, how it works. So these components are meant to help a reader prepare training and marketing materials, promote decisions for technology transfer and deployment. So how to conduct a demonstration or showcase, where are good examples of those type of things? How can we best educate our audience and provide technical assistance? So this middle component is more of the traditional technology transfer activities that have been occurring within DOTs and LTAP and TTAP centers for years. The third tier are evaluation decision-making components, things that can evaluate how technology transfer efforts are proceeding. They may even help lead to a decision regarding going forward to deployment. Is this, after all of our transfer, is this still going to be accepted or not? Will this change our decision to deploy a particular item within our DOT or outside of it? So there are tools and components in our guide for helping you evaluate progress and reaching deployment decisions. So it's a way to take our 10 components and walk a user through the different groups to see at what point am I in this process. Although a specific component might take priority or receive the greatest attention at times, in general, actions related to many and perhaps most of these are going to be ongoing throughout the entire technology transfer process. So there are a lot of possible paths here through the components. Logically, the foundational organization components might come first, followed by the knowledge building, followed by evaluation decision making. But that's not necessarily exclusive. So when components in one tier are being addressed, you still might want to be working on some of the others, and it might backtrack. And that's kind of what our guide can help a user walk through that process. Using those tiers and those user groups and those components, the end of Chapter 1 has a nice section that says, okay, we gave you all this information here. Where do I start? What do I need to consider? And they walk you through a case study to show how the guide is organized so that you can choose your experience level and then work your way through one or all of the different 10 components in the subsequent chapters that might help you out. So it's really kind of can customize it based on your experience level as a novice, an experienced practitioner, or someone with one particular challenge to address. And it might even help choose that path for you to determine which actions you'd like to accomplish or which components, might already be in place that I don't have to particularly worry about. So, as an example, at the end of the first chapter, we present a series of questions. And in fact, in each of the chapters, you will see the graphic, the question mark graphic there, which help a user navigate through that guide. So right at the end of Chapter 1, when deciding, okay, where might I fit in, how I might categorize myself as a user of this guide, am I a novice? And if I, meet that definition of a novice, the guide here tells me if I am, then I really should review all of the components in this chapter so that I can make sure that I've addressed all of my foundational organizational components. I can review any sort of knowledge building that I might need to do, and even future steps on evaluation of my T2 efforts. If not, if I don't think I'm a novice, go on to the next one. So for those who are old enough to remember the old Choose Your Own Adventure books, that's kind of what the leading questions here can help. So you can kind of categorize yourself and go off on your technology transfer adventure, if you would. Oops, back up here. So from there, if in fact perhaps you determine, no, I'm not really a novice, but I'm very interested in one particular component of technology transfer. I'm trying to really work with a champion, or we've lost our champion. How might I find a new one at this point in the process? How do I do that? Or I'm having trouble making sure that my stakeholders are remaining engaged in this as the technology transfer process moves on. You might want to just choose your particular component. Each component has a separate chapter in the guide. So chapters 2 through 11 are the 10 components that we mentioned earlier. For each component, there are a set of leading questions within the guide to kind of help you navigate through and find information. There's an overall graphic that you can look at and see some of the key points. There's a several paragraph description of that particular component. If you get involved in this, there are different actions that you might want to consider as a T2 specialist, if you would, when working with that component. They present particular challenges that you might face when working through that particular component. And then following that, some tools and strategies to overcome those challenges. So, and then I should mention that each chapter ends with some suggested readings, targeted references on that particular topic. So the guide from that introduction kind of places technology transfer in its context and helps you identify how you might best use that guide. But the meat of the guide, if you would, is the individual chapters which provide that type of information. For example, I mentioned the champion one a little bit earlier. Say you as someone who is working in technology transfer have been working with the product champion who had perhaps identified a need early on in the process and found a good solution, or they had a solution that they had been working with and championed it throughout their organization, and they resigned or took a new job or was promoted and is no longer involved in that, and you're involved in these activities to help transfer this information without a champion, without a technical champion. How might I get a new one? Where can I find one? What characteristics should they have? That might be the problem that you're trying to address from a technology transfer standpoint. So I might turn to the champion chapter, if you would, and I'd find right at the start of the chapter some leading questions. Is there an effective champion? If there is, skip on to the next question. If not, proceed directly into the component discussion. So you can read about it. You can read about the description, actions, challenges, tools, those type of things. Perhaps you do have an effective champion. So you move on to the next question. You want to say, is it meeting my needs and expectations? If it is, if the champion's working well, great, proceed to the next question. If not, go into the description and find some solutions, if you would, to getting your champion to meet your expectations, or maybe finding a co-champion that can fulfill some of the gaps that are there. Or if you're an experienced practitioner, maybe you'd just like to review the champion's role and what might be involved in that. So you can move on to that. But an experienced user might look at each of those and say, well, I have all those things taken care of. I have that effective champion. And you can proceed on to the next component. Oop, I see Barbara's raised her hand here on the item. There we go. I think Barbara's going to type a question. So these leading questions, these leading questions can kind of help you navigate through the different parts of the guide. So what does this look like underneath, if you would? There's an underlying logic to each of these, almost like a decision tree or a chart, so that there are different leading questions that you might need to answer. And if you're answering yes to all of them, then perhaps you don't need to go through and look through the information on Champion. If not, and you're finding no answers to some of these, what the guide does is leads you into some additional questions. Let me try to work my graphic magic here, but it doesn't seem to be. There it is. So underlying each of the questions, there's a bit of a decision tree, if you would. And while this doesn't show up to the user, like you won't see this, when our research team was putting the guide together, we tried to develop flowcharts for each of our components so that as a user goes through the guide, they will see the end results. But underneath that, all of the logic behind it helps you walk through the process without you actually having to see it. So it's kind of a nice, simple item for you to use. Wow, I'm having trouble with the here. Okay. The component descriptions also have a nice overview graphic which kind of summarizes the steps or requisite information for understanding the component. The footers in the guide have small graphics consisting of the tier and component, so you can keep yourself oriented as you go through there and use it pretty quickly. So there's the little, right in here is the little graphic, and as you look through the guide, you'll see these type of items in there. And for each of the components, there are ranging from 1 to, I think, 6 or 7 different case examples that illustrate particular points within the component. Generally, the case examples are narratives ranging from, a quarter to a half page long, which provide a case example that addresses the particular component we're trying to identify. So, for example, using our retroreflectivity example earlier, the Cornell Local Roads program, Dave Orr was kind enough to share one of his innovations for working with local agencies to help them, give them a tool to comply with that retroreflectivity regulation. And there's a nice little case example written up in there. Or PennDOT's process involving the use and deployment of tow plow technology for winter maintenance within the state is included in several. So there are different examples. One shown on the screen here is GRS, IBS bridges, and the importance of having a champion in taking that technology and making it useful or deploying it elsewhere within a particular state. So, for example, this particular case study focused on the state of Ohio, and starting in Defiance County, where that particular county engineer played a role of a champion in transferring not only the work that he did within his county, but even beyond that. So the specific actions that he took that made him an effective champion by recognizing the value of the technology, committing county resources to it, to expand from just a prototype to over 18 other additional installations in the county. He then co-authored a paper publishing the empirical evidence of success of that. He had strong collaboration with Federal Highway to further champion the technology beyond his county. So using tools like webinars or training video development, design guides, standard plans, all of those tools that not only the champion was involved with, but also serving as a technology transfer agent was able to utilize. So this particular picture up here shows the one from Defiance County from Federal Highway's Everyday Counts website, and as well as some other examples from Pennsylvania where some of those initiatives are currently taking place. So each of those component descriptions provide you with all of that information. So to kind of summarize it, and again, I understand it may be kind of confusing to try to work through in a webinar, but the idea is to present this information so that you can go and pick up the guide or get online and check the guide out, see the different chapters, identify the different parts that I've discussed, and as you read through it, it'll be a lot more clear as to how this guide might be useful for you. So this little graphic really is a summary, if you would, of the overall process of using the guide. The introductory questions are included at the top to kind of help the user identify their user type. Are you new to technology transfer? Then you might be a novice. Do you need a refresher, make sure I'm doing everything right? Then I'm probably a little bit more experienced. Or do I have a specific problem I'm trying to address? You know, those are our three user types. And from there, the components and associated tiers are included at the bottom. So you'll see the foundational, organizational, the knowledge building, and the evaluation and decision components. So the reader, as an example, might be someone with a particular problem to solve. So I'm looking at the user types at the top. I have a specific problem to solve. That's what I'm trying to do. So I need some help. Do I need help identifying a champion? If it's yes, it takes you to the champion chapter where it asks those leading questions. Is my champion meeting expectations? Do I have a champion? You know, is it meeting expectations? All those leading questions. And as you work through this, you'll be able to make the best use of those guides, of the guide. Do I have a technology transfer plan? No, I don't. Well, how do I develop one? And that chapter or that component will kind of walk you through the process. As a nice case example that Barbara put together from the National Institute of Health. So that's kind of the overall look at the process. Certainly the graphics used here are just for illustration. You're not going to see any of that. The guide is meant more for the informational side of things to do. Lastly, I should mention two remaining components. Number one, in the appendix, there's a nice checklist to kind of track some of your T2 process. There are a lot of important components, the 10. It can really be difficult to remember what you've accomplished, or there might be some things that you've overlooked, and that checklist can be used as a simple reminder to yourself when working through a particular project. So once things have been identified, defined, or addressed, you can just check it off or make yourself some notes. You can record names, important decisions, and accomplishments made for each of your different components. So the checklist in the back is very nice and relatively simple to use. And then lastly, the second appendix contains not only the suggested readings on technology transfer from the literature review, but also a link to the entire literature review for those who are involved more heavily in technology transfer and would like to see some of the research that's out there. I think in the future, as this guide gets disseminated and is being used, I know personally I've spoken with a few people who are using it, and some of the things they really like about the guide and how they're using it. But perhaps in the future this would be an ideal guide, if you would, to have a web-based format so that you can click on each of these different questions and it takes you to the key parts of the guide. But for now, we have a paper copy or a PDF, and you can navigate through there using the different tools provided in that guide. So there you go. That's a little bit about our guide. Hopefully, you can see that it was developed to help a reader kind of identify, plan, implement effective technology transfer strategies, accelerate informed decision-making for the use of innovations. It provides education for you about technology transfer itself, how it fits into a broader process of innovation deployment, and the guts, if you would, provide some nice useful tools for overcoming some of the barriers that you might face when performing technology transfer activities and making sure that you're addressing each of the components that you might need. So there you go. That's my last slide. We have some time. I went a little bit over the hour that I thought I was going to, but by 2 minutes, that's not too bad. So there you go. The guide itself is available online on TRB's website, and I think if anybody has any questions or comments or anything like that, feel free to put them in the chat box or unmute your phone. We have some time for some questions if need be.
Yeah, Mia, this is Matt. Are we able to open up the phone lines now?
Yes. If anyone has questions, they can either use the, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry. If they want to post questions in the chat box, they can, or they can unmute their phones by pressing the pound key and 6. I'm sorry, the star key and 6, and pose their questions that way.
So any questions from anybody on the line for Mark? While everybody's unmuting, I'll ask you a couple questions, Mark, real quick. I think we were going to try to, and this might be for me, we were going to try to see if anyone wanted to download this presentation. Can they download it from here? Oftentimes there's a pod for them to do that. Mia, do you know whether they'll be able to download that presentation? The people on the call.
I just pulled up the file share pod. It's now overlaying the presentation, and they can download it from there. It should be in the center of your screen.
Excellent, excellent. And Mark, it's pretty simple to find this report. I don't remember you covering this, but you know, the NCHRP report 768. If you just do a simple internet search on that, it'll lead you to it, and it is free as a PDF download. Correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. I just had one other quick question for you. Does the guide talk about, or the report talk about sort of barriers to technology transfer, whether that's sort of outreach issues or those kinds of things?
Good question, Matt. It does, and the way that the guide does that is in each of the chapters, which is dedicated to a particular component. So, for example, Chapter 4 is engaging decision makers, or Chapter 8 is conducting demonstrations or showcases. Within each of the chapters, following the leading questions and the basic description, there are some different case examples, and then each of them have considerations for actions that you should take involving a champion in doing a showcase. And then has, what are some of the challenges or barriers to doing that? Maybe you don't have a champion or a lead technology transfer specialist to lead a demonstration effort, or maybe your decision makers are really not engaged or supportive, or the innovation hasn't been adequately tested. And what the guide itself then does is provide some solutions to that. So if you have insufficient funding, maybe it's going back to your decision makers and asking for additional funds because of the importance of this, or finding your champion to help lead that demonstration effort and work through the logistics of providing that kind of information. So to answer your question, Matt, yes, each of the chapters identifies some of the challenges and barriers for the particular component, and then provides some actions to consider and tools to help overcome those. And it's a real wide range. I mean, some of it is what are some of the barriers associated with using social media for technology transfer. I would probably hazard to say that each of these chapters could probably be a guide in and of itself. For example, the second chapter deals with societal and legal issues, things like privacy, security of data, intellectual property issues. What sort of things should you consider with that? but there's an entire separate NCHRP effort on coming up with a guide for intellectual property issues happening right now. So each of the components does touch on those and provides additional resources that get into a little bit more detail on each of those. I have a separate question here that came in actually via my email, so that's kind of funny that someone's emailing while on the webinar, so that's a good thing. The question had to do with the color version of the guide itself. If you end up with or order a hard copy of the guide, it is in black and white, which is why I'll follow up with Matt's note regarding the PDF version, because that does have a color component to it, and it really does make a difference when working your way through the guide and in the different components.
It looks like, Mark, we also had a couple of questions coming through the chat. One webinar participant wanting to know, how is this different than 461? I'm assuming the NCHRP report 461.
And what is 461? I mean, I don't have that in front of me.
While someone maybe gives us a little bit more insight on that, it was also, oh, I'm sorry, I guess 461 is accelerating the implementation of research findings.
That effort was going on probably parallel. In fact, if Barbara, I don't know, to be honest with you. I'm not as familiar with that particular guide or document in terms of how it's organized or what types of information is in there. So honestly, I don't know. I'd be happy to find out, though.
And then also, would the guide be helpful in the organization of a pilot project for deployment of a new technology?
I would say yes. It depends on, and it's interesting, we talked a lot about this in putting the guide together. It depends on how your pilot, at what stage, if you would, you're going to implement your pilot project. So for example, some might argue that if you do a pilot of a particular technology, then it isn't necessarily a defined solution to a need. So before full technology transfer can occur, you want to make sure that the technology that you have as a solution to a problem is in fact a good solution that we want to deploy. And oftentimes a pilot might be done before that to help you make that decision, determine whether the technology is feasible. So in many ways, or from some perspectives, that a pilot might actually be part of the end of the R&D process before you get into technology transfer. Others might argue, well, the pilot can be part of that, meaning, okay, we've determined that, yes, this is the solution, it's feasible, it's viable, we're going to go with this, and the pilot is only the first stage, so it's a demonstration almost of how this is going to work. And yes, I would feel that this guide could help, not only in fitting it into the whole process, but one of the components that specifically deals with conducting showcases and those type of things can be very valuable, along with even the information sharing chapter about technical assistance, and those type of things. So you have resources available after your pilot to be able to have people to go and educate and inform and answer questions. So I would say yes. Also follow up just quickly on the previous question. Barbara Harder was kind enough to chime in that the acceleration of implementation of research findings looks at implementation processes used in other domains. So I imagine things used in private sector, perhaps, that can be brought into the transportation sector, or maybe not even private, but other public sectors. I will say that we did look at many of those processes from NIH to DOD and took valuable lessons, if you would, from there, or things that could be easily used in the transportation industry from some of those others. So much of that was incorporated not only in our definition, but some of the tools and components that we found. We even took a few from the private world. One of our team members has worked with some of the larger organizations such as Google and Apple, looking at creating culture change and having a culture ripe for innovation to help kind of develop some of these new innovations and then taking that next step to transfer those. So there's a few case examples from the private sector as well with good lessons learned that can be applied to the transportation industry. Anything else?
Do we have any other questions? There's no other questions in the pot. Well, looks like we might have one coming through from Linda. Oh, just a thanks. So anybody have any other questions that they want to hit star 6 and chime in with before we close it out? It looks like there's no more questions currently in the pod. Any other questions? Well, that being the case, I'll move that we close this out. I appreciate everybody attending, and Mark, thanks for giving us some insight into the guidebook and how it can be used and how it plays in our world. So we'll see everybody next time, I guess.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks.
Take care.